I'll be examining this topic through my questions. To what extent does political instability affect the economic growth of lower-income countries? I'd first like to draw your attention to this photograph from Dorothea Lange in 1936 entitled "The Migrant Mother." In this photo, we can see a mother with her two children, and this family had migrated to California in search of job opportunities, which would largely define this time period in which the photo was taken, which was the Great Depression, as many American families were in need of jobs. In fact, more than a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed, according to documentations from the Library of Congress. And this is important for my topic because it demonstrated an unprecedented economic downfall in American history, and that necessitated resilient and efficient government initiative for recovery efforts. And that came in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program. Essentially, what the New Deal did was provide necessary relief efforts for the American populace by providing jobs and other social services. And FDR's administration and his firm leadership in this time of crisis demonstrates how political stability is very important for the positive economic growth in a country. However, the inverse is also true, that political instability can negatively affect the economic growth of a country. And this is demonstrated in the late 20th century South Africa, as there was a large movement led by this man right here, Nelson Mandela, that was against the system of apartheid that promoted racist discrimination against Native Africans. And this brought global attention to this conflict in South Africa, and as a result, there was reduced investments within the country, and there was also sanctions imposed on South Africa. And specifically in Nelson Mandela's famous autobiography, A Long Way to Freedom, he talks in chapter 60 about his time spent in prison and situates that in the larger context of his struggle against racism and repression in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement demonstrates how civil unrest and political instability can lead to negative effects on the economy. In fact, this is proven through empirical research, as Ari Asen, a representative of the International Monetary Fund, and Francisco Viega, a professor of economics at the University of Minho, together did a study in 2011 that concluded that higher ethnic homogeneity and social cohesion are favorable to economic growth. So now I'd like to draw your attention to this map right here, which shows the 42 different countries in the world that are labeled by the International Monetary Fund as fragile and conflict affected. Now, these countries are labeled as such because they have poor economic management, poor social inclusion, and poor public sector management, as well as the presence of a peacekeeping mission, either that was established by the UN or regionally. And what's important to mention is that more than half of these countries are considered to be lower income, according to a 2017 report from the World Health Organization. Another piece of information to consider is that these fragile conflict-affected states are projected to have the slowest economic recovery from the COVID pandemic. In fact, in a 2022 report from the International Monetary Fund, it was projected that these states will not regain their 2019 GDP per capita levels until the year 2024, which is demonstrated here in this graph by this bold orange line that has a very negative growth, then followed by slow recovery until they finally reach the 2019 GDP level. But that's almost 3 years after this line in blue that represents emerging markets in developing countries. Now, Ari Asen and Francisco Vega list several reasons why political instability can negatively impact the economy. For one, it's detrimental to short-term policymaking. It also leads to frequent policy changes, which leads to volatility in the economy, and as a result, negative economic growth. It reduces investment, and it reduces productivity through civil unrest and reduction in research and development initiatives. And it also leads to less human capital, as people are discouraged from pursuing an education due to the uncertainty of the future and a politically unstable country. So now, considering some empirical analysis and some statistical evidence about this topic, there have been numerous studies about political instability and its implications on the economy, but I'd like to focus on two. The first being Robert Barro, who is a professor of economics at Harvard University, and in 1991, he did a study of 98 different countries between 1960 to 1985, and he measured political instability through a variety of variables, which was the frequencies of political revolutions, coups, and assassinations. And he found that these frequencies were inversely related to economic growth and development. In addition, Ari Asen and Francisco Viega in 2011 did a study of 169 different countries between 1960 and 2004, and they evaluated political instability through the changes in the head of government or in more than 50% of all cabinet ministers. And they found that with every time this change occurred, that the annual real GDP per capita growth rate decreased by 2.39%. So these studies clearly indicate a correlation between political instability and negative economic growth. However, there are some limitations to consider. As Parash Reddy, a professor of economics at the University of Northern Iowa, did a study in 2015 basically to modify pre-existing research done on this topic. And he lists several limitations with past studies, which is that they use older examples from the early to the mid-20th century, and thus that data that is used could be outdated. Because Reddy argues that the dynamics of economic development are rapidly changing because of the advancements in technology that we've seen in just the past few decades. He also considers that there's a minimal proportion of developing countries in the samples used in past studies, and which presents a problem because we're trying to analyze the developing world. So if only a small proportion is used, that could be not so representative of that demographic that we're trying to research about. Also, less developing countries lack proper reporting of important information that is used in these studies. So Reddy adapts his research and all of these limitations by using data that is updated to his time of study in 2015 and studying only developing countries that have some degree of reputable reporting. And even still, with all of his adaptations applied to his research, he still draws the same conclusions as past studies, which is that there is a strong and clear negative correlation between political instability and economic growth within a country. Another limitation to consider are confounding variables. Political instability, of course, is not the only thing that could affect the economy. In fact, Edward Crenshaw, a sociology professor at Ohio State University, did a research specifically about demographics, and he concluded that there is a robust negative effect of the average annual rate of growth of the population under age 15 on the economic development within a country. In addition, Roland Salem, a professor of political science at the University of Arkansas State University, in 2015, in his study, he analyzed different variables that could also affect the economy, namely income inequality, globalization, and neoliberalism. Now, the final limitation is how political instability can become a vague term, because often researchers use different variables or definitions to evaluate it in their research, such as through the frequency of revolutions or coups, assassinations. Some might view it as the propensity of government collapse. Others see it as the changes in the head of government, and others evaluate it through the level of democracy for the country. So with all these different definitions, it can become unclear as to what truly is political instability and how that truly affects the economy. But still, what is important to mention is that despite these differences in variables analyzed, the same conclusion is consistently being drawn, that there is a strong and clear negative correlation between political instability and the economic development within the developing world. So this leads me to my conclusion that political instability has a significant influence on the economic conditions of lower income countries. Considering the nuances and complications of this topic, it is important that we understand the complex implications of political instability so that international organizations like the International Monetary Fund can better work to address poverty and poor quality of living within the developing world. Thank you.
2 questions. How did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
So initially, as I started my research process, my question was kind of more broad. Instead of specifically political instability, I was trying to understand what were all of the factors that affected economic growth. But I found that that was a little bit too broad of a scope, and through my preliminary research, I consistently found studies and reports that focused on political instability and its impacts. And since they were so profound and even complex, I decided to just narrow my research questions specifically to how political instability has its effects on the economy. And as you can see with this presentation, I analyzed the nuances of that specific aspect.
How is your conclusion in conversation with a body of literature or other research sources you examined?
So my research has drawn from several studies and pieces of literature from several different authors, and their perspectives definitely contributed a lot to my conclusion, as through statistical analysis, they concluded that there was a strong indication that political instability leads to negative economic development. Also, through the historical examples that I mentioned about Nelson Mandela in South Africa, as well as the United States domestically during the Great Depression, this consistently helps me draw a conclusion that there was definitely a clear correlation between how stable a political state was compared to the economic development in the same country.
Good. Okay. Thank you.